Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to our latest informational interview. In this video, I talk with Dr. Jamie Marich from the Institute of Creative Mindfulness. We talk about an important topic, LGBTQIA and suicide. We talk about the increased risk of mental health, suicidal thoughts, attempts, and suicide among the community. We also share our personal stories and impact of suicide loss for each of us. It's definitely a conversation you don't want to miss. I hope you find some valuable information. There we are.
You
How
getting the
are
live
you?
message? I'm well, thank you.
Awesome.
I'm
Well,
just
let's get
checking
this
on
started.
I'm just
Hopefully,
looking on my phone to make sure we're live. Yes,
we are live.
success. So I'm just going to share it over with my personal page
Okay.
so that some of my friends can join in too.
Yeah, the moons and planets have aligned just to even get this far in the process. I feel like I'm knocking it out of the park.
I'm impressed. It takes a lot to up your Zoom and Facebook game, and I'm glad that you've done that, Shannon.
Yes,
Awesome
this
work.
is my second rodeo. So the first one wasn't so bad. We were live before I knew we were live. So there was
Yep.
kind of this awkward, like, I don't know if we're live. What are we doing? But now I've got the buttons down and
Can
it's
verify it.
awesome.
I see the button. I see it on my phone. So
We are
so good to be
good.
here.
Awesome. Welcome, everybody. I have been excited for this interview. I feel like all my interviews are great, but there are some that are just kind of close to my heart, and this one is definitely one of those. So I am Shannon Ortez. I am the president and founder of Light After Loss. We are a trauma-focused support system for survivors of suicide loss. And today we're going to be talking about LGBTQIA and suicide loss within that community. And I have asked Dr. Jamie Marich to join me today. And I will not do any justice to all the amazing things she's doing. So I'm going to have her introduce herself.
So hi, Shannon. I am
Hi.
so delighted to be here. I'm joining all of you today from my home base, my studio, and my office in Warren, Ohio. And up until the pandemic, I was based here, but traveled about half my month, both nationally and internationally, offering trainings in EMDR therapy, other trauma and addiction education, and association, loss, or other things I specialize in. And I also do programs in trauma-informed yoga, which is how I met you, dancing mindfulness and expressive arts. So much of my work is really about helping people have transformative experiences, whether that's my clients, whether that's my students who come to trainings, or people who I meet in the community doing expressive arts work. So I am an author. I recently wrote Trauma and the 12 Steps, which Shannon was gracious enough to endorse. That's my latest project that's out with North Atlantic Books. It's a new and revised version of a book I wrote in 2012. So I do write a lot of books, but I think more pertinent to the topic of our discussion tonight, I do identify as a survivor of suicide loss. Last year, I lost one of my dear friends. And I've had a lot of suicide loss in my life. So I feel this is a topic I can discuss with you both personally and professionally. And I also am a bisexual woman who grew up in a lot of religion. So there's just a lot of different angles I have on this topic that I can speak with you about. And I'm just delighted to have been invited.
Lots of layers, which is why I feel like when I think of this topic, I was like, you're the perfect person. You have every angle, you have all of those layers. So I'm so excited to hear what you have to say in that perspective. And you're right, our worlds collided at the Yoga Unchained facilitator training. And I was a yoga instructor at the time, but was really recommended to go to this by my therapist. So I lost my husband, Craig. It'll be 4 years, August 3rd. So I was in just entering year 2 then, and still really struggling. I felt like I was doing all the right things. I was a licensed counselor at the time, so I knew counseling was important. I'm doing all this stuff. And I think I even said in that training, I'm just broken.
Yeah.
Like I'm doing all the things I'm supposed to be doing and I still feel really broken. And I think that was the shift because it was a trauma focused yoga. And I learned
Mhm.
a lot more about trauma that even in grad school, I didn't get a whole lot of. And it opened the trauma doors. So I feel like survivors will call and say, I want to see a counselor, and the intake person will say, okay, well, it's loss, it's grief. And then I think with survivors of suicide loss, there is a trauma piece that we are missing,
For
and
sure.
that is what opened the door. And I said at the end of the training, you said, so what is your biggest concern about doing any of this? And I raised my hand and I said, if I'm okay to do this, am I
Mm.
going to be okay? And your words were, okay enough. And
Mm.
that to me, in my very, have always been black or white, all or nothing, pass, fail. That's it. There's no gray area. So that really opened the door to just wondering. Like at that time, I had let my license lapse. I was no
Mhm.
longer licensed as a counselor. I had no plans on going back to counseling because I was broken. I was really,
Yeah.
I had that record in my brain. I'm broken. I'm broken. I'm never going to be able to do this. So I started, after that training, I started to wonder, can I be okay enough to go back into clinical work? And what is that going to look like? And then 2019, Light After Loss was born. So I am okay enough.
Yeah.
And it was really the trauma door that opened. My counselor, who was amazing, kind of shifted with me, and we, kind of went into the trauma work, and it's been amazing. And I feel like those 2 years, I made more progress in 6 months doing trauma work than I did the entire 2 years I was trying to figure out what I was doing. So it really opened that door. So share with us, I know you said that you identify and you are a suicide loss survivor.
Mhm.
So what does that mean to you on a daily basis?
I mean, for me, it is one more facet of my trauma story. And like a lot of connections to my trauma story, it doesn't define me because I have done some work on it. And I do think that had I not done work around the various suicide losses, especially the one that hit me so hard last year, I could still be stuck in a loop of my whole life centers around this loss. And if that's where you're at today, I don't judge it. That's normal. Because Shannon, you bring up an excellent point that a lot of times loss of any kind is not identified as traumatic in nature. And so much of what I teach in my work is that grief is a wound, just as trauma is a wound. And I never say that to pathologize grief, just like I don't pathologize trauma, because so much of trauma is about what happens to you instead of what is wrong with you.
Yeah.
And a lot of the same mechanisms for healing can certainly apply. What being a survivor of suicide loss means to me today, especially as it relates to my dear friend Jason's death, is that so much of what I do feels inspired by his memory. Whether that be the push his death gave me to do further work in my professional sense, but even more than that, the push his death gave me was to take better care of myself in a personal sense and to really identify what is important to me. And it was a very tough loss because with that one, I did not go through a sense of I should have done something more or I could have done something more. I had a couple moments like that overcame me. But with that particular death, and he was just a very dear friend of mine for over 20 years. We met in college and he circled back with me in adult life as he was attempting recovery again. I knew I gave all I could. Yet I did have a lot of anger underneath because of what I perceived as kind of leading him to that. And just things to work through. And I've just, I guess I'm getting deep right away. You're like Barbara Walters. I mean, I've had a,
Sorry.
no, nothing to apologize about. I mean, and I've had a very interesting relationship with the phenomenon of suicide my whole life. I lost my first friend to suicide when I was 12. I've had several individuals in my life die by suicide, various degrees of closeness. And with Jason's death, it was probably the person who was closest to me. I mean, he was like a brother in so many ways. And a lot of his trauma is connected to the shame of being a gay individual. And that's why I'm really glad we're having this discussion. And I you know, I have some evidence that it was a precipitating factor at the end. And his story is like the story of so many other individuals who identify, I like to call it on the rainbow spectrum. I know we talk about LGBTQIA and plus, because there's a lot of other letters we can include as well, but
Right.
just individuals who identify in a way that has not traditionally been considered mainstream, you know, especially in this part of the country, especially in Ohio, where we're at. So yeah, and I think another part of what defines my relationship with suicide is that I spent a good part of my life in a state of what I call chronic low-grade suicidal ideation from when I was about 9 up until my mid-20s when I first had trauma therapy. And as I've shared with you privately, it's still something that can cross my mind at the level of thought. So I you know, there's just so much in my life that has come up with it that I don't like, especially when I think of Jason. I don't begrudge him the choice he made, because I don't really believe it was a choice at that point. It was what the unhealed trauma in so many ways had driven him to. And I remember when I first found out the news, I felt about every different emotion all at the same time. It was a sense of rage that it happened, but also this kind of sense of clarity and peace that he was finally at peace.
Yep.
And I think fundamentally what it means for me is understanding this idea that all feelings will hit you all at once. And that's okay. That's part of being human, A, and B, that's part of what it means to navigate loss, especially tragic loss as a human. And so much of what I feel inspired to do in my work is to validate people in their humanity.
Yeah. Yeah. That these feelings, all of them, all at the same time. Yep. Welcome aboard. Like it's
Yes.
just a part of the journey. And there's no right or wrong. And there's no timeline. There's no letting go of any of that. And just, I always say in our groups, sit with your shit. And,
Mm-hmm.
it, letting those feelings, just be,
Yeah.
not trying to fix it, not trying to take it away. Part of the healing process is just kind of embracing them, as hard as that is. And it's not easy
Mm-hmm.
by any stretch of the imagination.
That's right.
So as far as I'm going to read some statistics, because you
Mm-hmm.
did say, you know, you felt it was a precipitating factor and in Jason's loss.
Yeah.
And so some of the statistics that I have found online, and I use a lot of the Trevor Project, which are
Good.
youth related, but NAMI had a couple that in general, you know, the LGBTQIA, the rainbow spectrum,
Mm-hmm.
is just at higher risk,
Of
like
course.
higher risk for mental illness, higher
Mm-hmm.
risk for suicidal thoughts, higher risk for suicidal attempts, higher risk for suicide in general. Is just higher risk. So specifically 40% of transgender adults have
Mm-hmm.
attempted. Like that, even like 40%, that is
Mm-hmm.
like approaching half.
Yep.
Like that just breaks my heart.
And I've heard
Um,
it's slightly higher than 40 from
yeah,
some
and
other sources. Yeah,
that's really only
it's
what we know for
mm-hmm.
sure. Um,
Exactly.
and then as far as youth is concerned, LGB, they specify just
Mm-hmm.
LGB, 3 times as likely to consider suicide,
Mm-hmm.
4.5 times more likely to attempt suicide, 2 times as likely to feel sad or hopeless, and then 4.5 times more likely to make an attempt that results in injury, so a
Yeah.
poisoning, or that needs medical attention.
Hmm.
So those are just some of the statistics. I feel like of the things that we can track. I feel like what we don't know would probably be even astronomically more.
And I'm glad you made that point, that whenever we see statistics like that, even from reputable sources, we can assume it's low ball
Yeah,
because of stigma around reporting and because not everything can be investigated precisely with numbers.
yeah. So what do you think? What are your thoughts on those statistics other than they're low? We know they're low.
Hmm.
So what are
Yeah,
your
and obviously a lot of anger that they're there, that these
yeah,
are statistics we're even reporting. But when people ask why, what's the connection, it really all has to do with shame, because shame is so much of what drives any mental health concern or any addiction concern. And to be at this place where you feel like, or where you're, because I know we talk about it often as a choice, but as I referenced with Jason's case, it's like the choice is taken away. It's a survive. It's a I just can't deal anymore. I mean, there's so many like phrases we can put on the why or the lead, but it really does center around this idea of shame. And so, what is shame is a natural question a lot of people ask, and kind of the canned answer that a lot of us got in graduate school or in addiction treatment as well. Guilt is when you feel bad about what you do, and shame is when you feel bad about who you are. And there's a lot to that. I mean, I think that's a pretty fair distinction. But if we're looking even deeper at it, that feeling bad about who you are can also be compounded as feeling bad about who you love, about what you are, feeling like you have internalized all of these negative statements that you have received about yourself, whether directly or indirectly. Because I know growing up as a young bisexual girl, I didn't receive a lot of direct slurs at me because I wasn't out. I didn't dare come out because of what I was raised in, especially as it related to religion. So a lot of the indirect slurs I got was the way I heard people in the churches I went to talk about gay people, talk about queers, fags, name it, name the insult. And so I was still in this place of like questioning, well, where do I fit in all this? And who do I like? And I internalized a lot of that bit by bit, piece by piece. And so fundamentally, shame is when you start believing horrible things about yourself as fact. Like, I am defective. A word that's used in a lot of church circles is abomination to talk about being gay or queer or trans. And that can be internalized as a statement like, I am an abomination, I am flawed, I am demonic, I am possessed, wherever it may be. And I know I give the church a hard time, but it could come from society too. It could come from bullying. I mean, I think of how many times words like fag or queer or just a variety of other insults are used in a very derogatory way just on the playground. And that can also be something that a young child internalizes over time. And so where it really kind of crystallizes as shame is when these horrible beliefs we have about ourselves really kind of ingrain as truth, at least our perceived truth. And my favorite definition of shame comes from the French Cuban author Anais Nin. And she said, shame is the lie that someone told you about yourself. Such a good quote. I get
I
goosebumps every
love
time I
that.
say it.
Yes,
That
I do love that.
shame is the lie somebody told you about yourself. And so, yeah, it's a lie. Being told directly or indirectly that I'm an abomination is a lie, that I'm possessed is a lie. But then the problem becomes we hear it enough and enough that it crystallizes as truth.
Yeah.
And then that is what drives so many of us to these places of despair that can lead to places like in self-injury, addiction, acting out in various ways. And then for so many of us feeling like, I am never going to be able to live in this body in this life. I am trapped is actually a big negative cognition I had for a big part of my journey. And so much of when I even say that now, I am trapped, I just feel trapped being me in this world. And that is where suicide can feel appealing.
Yep. It starts to creep in.
Yeah.
So on that note, um, opening the discussion about the word survivor, and you did
Yeah.
right from the get-go identify yourself as a suicide loss survivor.
Hmm.
So something we have discovered through supporting survivors and, kind of talking about suicide out in the open every day, like the sky is blue, we talk about suicide, that a lot of people do not even realize or identify themselves as a survivor. And
Hmm.
being able, so when we say we have survivor support groups, I'm not a survivor. But when I look at them and I hear their story in my head, they're a survivor. Like it is, I think, even just wrapping people's head around the fact that somebody died by suicide and it impacted you. So that means in some way you are a survivor. So there was a big study at the University of Kentucky by Julie Sorrell, I think is her last name. I think I'm pronouncing that right. And she put it on a continuum, that it's not just you are or you aren't. It
Hmm.
is a continuum. And that in her research that about 115 people are impacted by suicide, by a suicide death.
Hmm.
And that is on a continuum. So maybe it was just your coworker or your neighbor. So it wasn't maybe direct impact, family of origin. And so it kind of the continuum goes in. And she was able to identify that about 12 people for every suicide death are devastatingly impacted. And that's where the word survivor comes in.
Hmm.
But we try to work on that continuum, because even if you're a coworker and
Yeah.
that person worked in the cubicle and you talk to that person every day, I feel like that is going to impact you. You're not just gonna be okay and life moves on and you're not going to have any feelings or emotions. So being able to open that survivor to, if you are impacted in any way, it's okay to get support. You
For
don't
sure.
have to be, it doesn't have to be your husband, it doesn't have to be your child. That if somebody's loss, death by suicide, is impacting you in any way, then you are a survivor. That it
And even as you're talking, I'm thinking of a lot of the people in my life who were affected by my grief I dealt with
Yeah,
um, following Jason's death. And what you said just really struck a chord, that so many folks in our recovery community, in various faith and spiritual communities that we hung out with, even if they wouldn't have described themselves as super close to him, still felt the sting of that. And I'm thinking of survivor, one definition of it is just anybody who's left behind,
yeah,
anybody who might be asking hard questions in the wake of a death like that. I definitely think you qualify, and I'm so glad to hear the continuum being brought
yeah,
up again. So it's like we were saying earlier about okay, we can get so black and white about it. I'm okay or I'm not okay. Maybe it's somewhere in the middle.
yeah. And being able to identify that continuum and making it okay, like almost broadening that horizon for people to include more people on the impact of suicide,
Mhm.
which I think it makes it easier to support people and identify the people who need support. So that has become a part of our work unknowingly, is just educating people on what the impact of suicide is and who a survivor is. And even if you don't identify as a survivor, quote unquote, you if you are impacted, we can offer support
Mhm.
in some form or fashion. So not necessarily getting stuck in the black and white of I am or I'm not. Which leads me to the trauma piece, which is
Mhm.
kind of your niche. Um, my shift from grief to trauma really was the kind of the door that opened, and I went from broken
Mhm.
to healing. That healing was possible. That was another thing you said in the Yoga Unchained, is that you can heal from trauma. And again, like a light bulb. I don't know if it was the yoga, if I was out of my comfort zone, but I just heard that like for the first time, like you can heal from trauma. And and that really, you know, kind of shifted like, oh, then I need to work toward that. I'm not broken and I'm not stuck. I can work toward healing. So what, as a trauma therapist, someone impacted by suicide loss, why do you think identifying the level of trauma is important when working with suicide loss? Why is the trauma important?
So I do this in every interview. It's important to get on the same page about what we mean when we're talking about trauma. So I use a very broad definition of it, which comes from the word origin, and that is trauma means wound. Trauma comes from the Greek word meaning wound. And we can split hairs clinically about certain diagnoses like post-traumatic stress disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The reality, though, is anybody who has been wounded potentially has trauma that can be healed. And I mean, a couple things are significant. That suicide loss itself, make no two bones about it, is traumatic. And even the DSM validates that now. If
Yep.
you look under the criterion for post-traumatic stress disorder, a tragic death is the word that is used, and suicide definitely qualifies there, can be grounds for a post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis. So I do think that's an important component that we have to look at. But I'm really glad you're going there with looking at the broader impact here, because I've dealt with clients over the years, and I think to a certain extent, I felt this like with my friend who died by suicide when we were 12. Like, we weren't supremely close, but we were friends. She had slept over at my house. We were on the same sporting team. And I think a lot of people who were close to me weren't quite sure why it rattled me so much, because we weren't like best friends, or we weren't super close. But we were 12. I think
That
any death
alone,
by,
right there, 12.
yeah, any death by suicide at that age can potentially rattle the whole peer group. And it can certainly be traumatic and wounding and a shock on the system, and definitely deserves being addressed as traumatic. And then there's another facet of this here, which is the other unhealed traumas and wounds it can link into. Because so much of what we talk about in modern mental health world around trauma-focused care, especially as EMDR therapists, is a person can be presenting with something quite recent. But chances are, if it has reminiscent effects of things that happened earlier in life, and those had never been fully healed, then a lot of those wounds are going to reopen or resurface, especially if they never healed all the way. So it was so interesting, because I'll just use myself as an example, because that's what I can speak to most fully. When Jason died, bear in mind, I was 18, 19 years old when I met him. And I still, in my own therapy work today, am working on healing different layers of many things I went through at 18 and 19, including my own coming out. Or I didn't fully come out. I knew I needed to, but I didn't at that age. I knew about my sexuality. So even though those are things I had worked on quite a great deal, when Jason died, they naturally resurfaced. So anything connected to a death, not let alone a tragic death, can potentially bring up other stuff from the past that an individual will either embrace the challenge of healing, using that word embrace, or try to shove away again.
Yeah.
And Shannon, the longer I've done this work with both trauma and loss and the interplay, I'm convinced it's not our feelings that cause us the problems. It's the fear we have around feeling our feelings and everything we do to shove them down that causes us the problems in the long run.
Because society gives us all those messages
Yeah.
of, you know, don't feel, you know, it's going to be okay. All the cliches that at one point would just light me on fire, because it's like, how can you even fathom the fact that, you know, just buck up, it's going to be okay. Or I've had survivors who lost their child, and people will say, well, you have another child. Like, what? Like,
Yeah.
and, you know, I think a lot of people, they don't know what to say. So, and they feel like they need to say something. So the thing they say is probably the most unhelpful. So
Correct. and
Yeah.
I grew up around a lot of those placations. I still hear them. And I think so much of that is our discomfort just as a people, especially as Western people, with death
Yep.
and not knowing what to say. I remember the first well, it wasn't the first major loss, but the first major family loss I dealt with death was my grandfather when I was 7 or 8. And I was just so afraid to talk to my grandmother after that, who I was very close to. But so much of the fear was I didn't know what to say to her.
Yeah.
And I was already feeling that at 7 years old.
Yeah. Yeah. We just don't, like grief paranoia or something.
Mhm.
Um,
And
Grief avoidance.
sometimes what I tell people in these circumstances and when we're having these conversations is if you don't know what to say that. What can
Exactly.
I say? I and I mean, if you can genuinely say I'm here in the way you need me to be, often I will ask the question, how can I best support?
Yep.
And sometimes the best thing you can just say is validating, yeah, this sucks, or
Yep.
this, you don't have to make it better. And I think as a people, we're so uncomfortable with both grief and death at the root of that, that we feel this drive that we have to make it better.
Yeah. We need to fix it. And I
Mm-hmm.
can tell you, there are no words that are going to fix it. So you might as
Correct.
well not even try. And we always encourage people, a lot of times we get family members who don't know how to support their
Mm-hmm.
survivor.
Mm-hmm.
And what do I do? What do I say? I feel like I'm making things worse. And really, just be there.
Mm-hmm.
Just sit with them. Literally saying nothing, the silence is
Mm-hmm.
probably better than
Yeah.
anything. Just the presence.
Yeah. It's something Henry Nouwen, who is one of the great spiritual giants of my life, big influence on me, called the ministry of presence.
Yeah.
And so much of what I teach therapists is when you're taking a person through trauma work, even if you're doing a great advanced technique like EMDR, don't doubt that the power of your presence is has to be there too, and is maybe even more important in certain contexts. As you were talking about presence, another major loss I had recently is that my cat of 16 years died at the beginning of the summer. And I remember the night it happened, my best friend in the whole world, Allie, who's just, I can't speak enough of her. She just came over and watched movies with me.
Yep.
She knew there was nothing she could say. She knew it sucked. She's also a survivor of a lot of tragic loss in her life. And we just sat on the couch and were friends and cried when needed to cry. And there's so much power to that, because it means you're not afraid of other people's brokenness.
Yeah.
And as you said, not trying to fix, but just be.
Just be. Just show up and just be there. If you can do that, then you can support a survivor, because there are no
Correct.
words. So don't even worry about the words. Just show up. Building on that, so trauma within the community.
Mm-hmm.
So you have suicide loss
Mm-hmm.
and increase in mental health, suicide attempts, all of those things. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. You
Mm-hmm.
already kind of mentioned the layers of trauma that oftentimes, when you identify as LGBTQ, that the bullying, the social isolation, talk about the layers of trauma that a lot of times, we're working with the suicide loss, but the layers of trauma go back decades sometimes.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the flaws of the post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis as it currently stands in the DSM, is that it's very event-centric. It's assuming that one bad thing happens to you, and then all of these fallout symptoms can happen, which is true, yet there's also more to it. Because if you think of an event like a death by suicide, yes, that's clearly a qualifying event. But bullying, which is a huge example, most people who are bullied get bullied every day, and sometimes it's in various degrees. Sometimes it comes with physical injury. A lot of times it's psychological, emotional injury. But I've heard people describe certain traumas and certain forms of oppression as the trauma of 1,000 paper cuts, if we're using the wound metaphor, that it may not be like that one big hate crime, which could happen at some point, but think of more of what you may feel on the day-to-day basis,
Yeah.
going to school and getting looked at a certain way, sitting around your family and knowing that they disapprove if they really knew you, and then turning so much of that wounding inward. There's really no no better way that I can explain it than that look at the wound metaphor and consider that wounds come in all shapes and sizes. And when you're dealing with oppression or discrimination of any kind, it's never just one thing.
Yeah. I love
It's
the
a
1,000
combination.
paper cuts
I
metaphor.
owe that
That
to a
makes
student of
sense.
mine somewhere along the way when I was teaching a course. Someone said that and it just clicked.
That makes complete sense because one paper cut is painful. Paper cuts are not huge. Like I don't need to go to the hospital, but they're
I got
certainly
one
bothersome.
right now. Yeah.
Right. They're bothersome and painful. So to have 1,000, that makes complete sense. Like that just resonates with me. I love that. Which leads to unique challenges. So we do have, and this was not, again, a part of our mission or plan. It really was, okay, we're going to start this group and see who comes. And one of our largest populations is the LGBTQ community because they have suffered a lot of suicide loss because of the increased risk. But as each of, we can all gather and we can relate to each other's stories. We can say, I get it, which is valuable or almost invaluable to a suicide loss survivor. I truly understand what you are talking about because I have walked in those shoes. Not everybody can say that. And I encourage people not to say it. If you haven't walked in a survivor's shoes, don't say that you get it because you don't. So, but the unique challenges, as someone who lost their spouse and I have 2 little ones, the challenge for me is very different than a parent who lost their child. We can relate to the suicide loss, but there are unique challenges. What are the unique challenges of being in that community and being a suicide loss survivor?
God, it could have been me. I remember that was one of the first things I said after Jason's death. Knowing how much messaging he got in the church really impacted his sense of shame. And that was so much of my story and how I grew up. I think for a lot of us, especially a lot of us who have shared in the pain of our shame with each other, and then when we see a fellow human go like that, it could have been me.
Which is
that's jumping out in my gut as probably the biggest unique challenge, especially those of us who've attempted before or who have spent so much of our lives in the ideation of it.
Yeah, and then another, just from hearing stories and navigating loss with other survivors, there are things that are unique when it especially comes to, families who are not accepting of their lifestyle. And then a suicide happens and the person, their partner, is really kind of left out in the dust or blamed for the suicide. It was because of this lifestyle and because of you that this happened, as if you don't have enough weight to carry, then somebody is putting that burden on top of you.
And there's a term in the grief literature that's very potent here, which is disenfranchised grief, which is you have legitimate grief because of someone's loss, but it's not socially acceptable for you to, let's say, come to the funeral or share your grief with the rest of the family and friends that may be affected. And a lot of queer suicides that I've dealt with, there's been at least one case of disenfranchised grief that I've also felt obliged to attend to. in the circle of what has happened. It's insidious. So that is another unique challenge that can come up for sure. Um, I, oh, and I know, and I'm going to speak in general terms here. Some in knowing families of LGBTQ individuals who've died by suicide, I can see two extreme responses happen, and sometimes, as we said, it can happen in the middle. There can be a lot of, I mean, I believe they're still feeling grief, but a lot of anger, like you said, blaming the lifestyle. And I hate that word because it's not lifestyle, it's who you are, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And then I see a lot of parents, especially, maybe take a good hard look at themselves after a suicide and ask, is this something that I did or said or contributed to? And I think people can either embrace that soul surging and make some good changes in the wake of it, or it can swallow them whole.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's been disheartening because as a suicide loss survivor, I've had so much support, an entire community of support. So to be completely isolated and not even be able to attend the funeral or put flowers on the grave or stay in the house that we lived in, like it is just like, even as a survivor, it makes my jaw drop. Like, oh my gosh, and supporting them even more through some of those things that are just jaw dropping. I don't even know even the right word is the suicide loss is hard enough. And then you have those layers on top of it.
Yes.
So shifting back to trauma, you have a ton of resources available. So the first book I read after the Yoga Unchained was The Trauma Made Simple. Because again, even though I was a counselor and I went to grad school, I felt like, did I miss this day in class? Where was I when we talked about trauma? Because I don't remember. And now, as a clinician, I did have people who came in and certainly were diagnosed with PTSD. Most of them, the typical, when we think of PTSD, we think of war veterans.
Yep.
So, or children of sexual abuse, physical abuse, like the blatant PTSD, like these are those folks. And so when the Trauma Made Simple, and it just put it in language and realizing I have trauma, like how did I not know as a clinician that I have trauma? And being able to really just broaden that. So what other resources? I feel like you have so many resources when it comes to, if you're a suicide loss survivor and this resonates with you, like, yes, I'm grieving, but there's something I'm missing and maybe it's the trauma piece. What can they tap into to kind of learn more?
Sure. I really want to pitch the website that goes along with the book Trauma Made Simple. And so the website is just www.traumamadesimple.com. And I've set that up as a free resources site for the public. So everything I have done that is free of charge online, you can access through that website. So I have a lot of YouTube videos, many that are for the general public. Some are a little more clinician specific. I have the whole trauma-informed yoga series up there that people can access, some yoga nidra activities, articles, interviews. Any interview I do, I end up linking on here as well. So check it out, because especially if books may not be affordable or accessible to you, but you have internet access, you can get most of what you need right on that site. And then in terms of my other books, if you have more of an artist's nature, I can give a plug to Process Not Perfection, which is my book that came out last year. It can be used as a self-guided journey of the expressive arts into a healing process. As you mentioned, Trauma in the 12 Steps is the revised edition of my book that's out this year. And if there's an addiction component to what you might be struggling with, that would likely be the book I'd recommend.
Yes. And so this is the new book. Woo-hoo.
Lovely.
And what is special about today in this book?
So the audiobook is out today.
Yes, we need to celebrate.
Oh, thank you, Shannon. Yeah, so the book was released on not January, July 7th. I'm getting my months mixed up. COVID and
We
Zoom
all
have
are.
to
What
me.
day is it? I don't know.
Yeah, so July 7th, the book came out, and then they moved up the audiobook release date today to July 28th. So if you go on Audible, if you're more of an audiobook listener, it's now there.
Yes, which I'm super excited about. I have my copy because I did the endorsement in
Endorsement.
here, which is awesome. But I am definitely more of an audiobook kind of person now. Trauma changes your brain. You could do a whole
Mm-hmm.
seminar on that. And my focus is still one of the things I struggle with the
Mm-hmm.
most in being able to, I read a paragraph, like, what did I just read? So it
Mm-hmm.
takes me, even having gone to grad school, and I was one of those students where I could read it, I could hear it, absorb it, spit it back out, like one of those people that you just love to hate in grad school. Now, like I can't remember where I put my keys, my
Mm-hmm.
phone, and reading, I'll read a chapter and don't even remember what I read. But if I hear it
Mm-hmm.
and I read along with it, like the double
Mm-hmm.
whammy seems to work well for me. So I'm excited that the audiobook, because I'm probably going to reread it with that,
How
just to
wonderful.
absorb it a little bit
Yeah,
more.
and sometimes our learning styles change over time, which is normal too, because I think we all have different learning styles anyway. And some people absorb more through hearing, some people through reading, some it's both. Like I do both audiobooks and conventional reading, just depending on the context. So, yeah, thank you for giving the audiobook the shout out. And something my publisher said is during the pandemic, audiobook sales have skyrocketed,
Yeah, and
which
that's not at all surprising. I think
yeah, I
podcasts
think we
and
could unpack
audiobook,
that, but mhm.
yeah, have, because what else, what am I going to do with my downtime? Try to be productive or something.
Right. And the fact that we're kind of in this global trauma, we're all feeling it in different ways, of course, but I think it can help to be read too.
For
It's a
sure.
nice act of self-care. So,
Yeah, and talk about the addiction piece. So obviously we are trauma focused because I feel like that was my missing piece. Like
hmm
I don't know if it would have made a difference had I known right out the gate I have trauma, or if I just needed to be, um, I don't like the word ready, and you've taught me that, prepared,
hmm
in order to kind of open that door. But what is the link between trauma and addiction, and why do we know that? If we're attending 12-step groups, or if we're a clinician having 12-step groups, why do we need to know about trauma? How are they even linked?
yeah. So the link is dissociation. And if the field is ill-informed about trauma, they're even more ill-informed about dissociation. So I want to spend a little time talking about that since you asked. To quote the words of a dear friend and clinical person who works with me, Amy Wagner, if trauma is walking through the door, dissociation is parking the car. That they're twin riders. They tend to go together. So dissociation, we'll look at word origin there too, simply means to sever. So it could mean severing from the present moment through things like zoning out, daydreaming. And for children who are frequently traumatized or frequently injured, dissociation tends to become a regular occurrence. And in young kids, it usually manifests in the way I mentioned: zoning out, checking out, excessive daydreaming, not paying attention in school. It's not all ADD, hint, hint. And I know, for example, when I was a kid, I was routinely told, oh, Jamie looks like she's been beamed in the head with a fastball. And then the more I learned what dissociation was as I came up, of course I was. I was there, but I didn't want to be there. And dissociation is a natural protective mechanism of the human brain, to keep us safe in situations where we don't feel very safe, or in certain circumstances to meet a need when we feel that a need is not being met. In a lot of ways, that's how what we can talk about as parts may form. And so part of the work I'm doing along with one of my colleagues is this model we're calling addiction as dissociation, which is that when you have been traumatized, dissociation is a natural, normal response. And if a child especially dissociates enough, their brain essentially becomes bonded to that state. their brain becomes used to that state. And so then maybe a little later in life, for some not, because a lot of kids start using in single digit ages or start acting out. Once that chemical enters the picture, or an acting out behavior that can create a dopaminergic or dopamine releasing response, it essentially amplifies what the brain has already connected as normal. And so addiction really is a manifestation of dissociation. It's part of the dissociation phenomenon. If you're looking at a pure DSM PTSD definition of it, addictions or other acting out behaviors can simply be part of the avoidance strategies. And anything that we can do that can become addictive is really to either help us avoid, perhaps meet some kind of survival need, again, which goes back to dissociation. So a lot of times what happens is when people end up entering recovery or getting what we might call clean and sober, then there's still a lot of dissociation underneath that needs to be cleaned up. And that's, I shouldn't say cleaned up, addressed. And that's a manifestation of unhealed trauma. So having a greater sense of understanding about dissociation, I think, is really the next frontier that we have to tackle here as part of educating on trauma.
Yeah, and what I relate that to, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. So my oldest, it was 2 weeks before school was starting. She was going into her 3rd grade year. 3rd grade is a pretty, kind of pivotal point where you're not working in groups anymore. You're sitting at desks. You're learning a lot of foundational kind of concept, specifically math. Now, she did not get the math gene at all from me, so she got some of it honest, but it was about, especially this last year, 6th grade, but definitely saw it in 5th grade. And I was telling kind of her teachers in 3rd and 4th grade that she's not, I don't know what she's doing while she's at school, but she literally is not spitting it back out at home. Like I almost had to reteach her. And so then we get to 5th grade and her teacher is telling me, like, she is missing almost like, I always say, ice cream scoops of information, like something.
It's a good metaphor.
And I think because more than likely in her 3rd and 4th grade year, she was checked out. It was so overwhelming just to be at school. She started to hate school. She didn't want to be there. She went through some severe separation anxiety. I believe she was worried about me all day. Like, I don't care what you're teaching. All she's worried about is my mom okay? Is my mom okay? So she was, in some sense, like, she was checked out, disassociated, because if she was at all there, I feel like she would have picked up something, but it also would have been too overwhelming. She had no support, no way to manage. So I have to check out in order just to be able to sit at my desk and be okay until mom gets me.
That's a perfect description of this phenomenon I'm talking about. Yep.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of times teachers don't necessarily know, because Zoe is always the quiet, compliant, never causes any problems kind of kid. I almost wished that she was tipping desks, because then that would have identified she's struggling. But she sat there, checked out for 6 hours, came home, and, was not a problem. So when I'm going to them saying she's struggling, and they're like, no, she's fine.
And you bring up an excellent point here, that when it comes to trauma manifestations, it can be kind of a too much of, which we often call hyper arousal, which can be like the turning over desks and the quite obvious acting out, or it can be more on the lower end, what we might refer to as hypo arousal, and that was me growing up. I was not an obviously problem kid. I mean, I was odd, and that's a lot of why I was bullied, because once more, I just didn't feel like I fit in, in this time, in this life, in this body. But yeah, I was that kid who was more likely to check out, and you would think I was okay most of the time, but there would be this, Jamie, are you here? Are you here? So Yeah, good description of what we're talking about with dissociation. So much of addiction treatment, kind of circling back here and wrapping up, is that we have to be treating the trauma in a responsible way. And I get into that in a lot of my work, how we can do it and not overwhelm people. But fundamentally, in order for addiction to really be eradicated, we have to heal the trauma and the dissociation underneath.
Kind of the root of the issue instead of putting a Band-Aid over it, really addressing the root of the issue.
Yeah. And the thing with Band-Aids is we need Band-Aids. Well, I mean, I have to be clear about that. We need Band-Aids, we need stitches, we need dressings to stop the bleeding and to help ensure that a person is prepared enough to do that deeper healing. But when we don't facilitate ways to help people heal at a very deep level, it's just like rebandaging a wound. And yeah, you can technically live that way, but it makes you more susceptible to further injury.
Yeah. And knowing that, addiction and trauma are linked, and which means suicide loss survivors are more likely to have addiction issues, diagnoses, PTSD, and ultimately, if it goes on too long, survivors of suicide loss are more likely to take their lives.
I believe that.
So, and that goes back to, I feel like we are missing the boat. There's over 6 million survivors of suicide loss in this country alone, and we have limited specific services for them. And so when we do suicide prevention, we're trying to hit the masses, but we're forgetting about this really specific population that are at risk. If I was a male and lost my spouse, it's nearly 50% more likely that I would take my life. So
Makes
not
sense.
Getting those people in treatment, support groups, whatever they need in order to break that cycle, I feel like we're still going to be struggling with the suicide rate going up if we don't address the suicide loss piece, those left behind, because ultimately then we become a statistic.
That's right.
So, Light After Loss, survivors supporting survivors. As someone who is impacted by suicide loss, what do you say to somebody who is walking this journey?
It's hard to give a general answer because everybody's different.
Yeah.
And I, as a healer, I of course want to respect that. So I think I go to what I shared earlier. My questions tend to be, how can I best support you? Because I don't want to make assumptions that the needs I had are the needs that you have. And I'll let you know if the support you're seeking is what I can provide. And if I can't, then I'll try to point you in the direction of a resource that can meet your needs. But in the meantime, what I can offer, when I can offer it, is my presence. And that's what I would say. And to also hit on a theme we've hit several times in this interview, to validate that what you're feeling is valid. And that mess of you could be feeling 85 different things all at the same time is valid. It's normal. And that grief is messy. Grief is messy. Something I really take on in my work is, and this is also in good fairness to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, because she never meant her grief stages to be stages. People know them as stages. They were simply themes. That bargaining, anger, loss, denial, these are things you can feel all at the same time. And she even said that in a quote that I cite in a lot of my teachings, that they are not some linear stops on the timeline of grief. And that really speaks to me, that loss is not a linear phenomenon. And those of us who are in a position to support survivors of suicide loss, or really any death, have to be attuned to that.
Yeah. That it is more of a crazy roller coaster that goes around and really just strapping yourself in, because it's not. And I feel like it is ongoing. I think I have reached kind of the level of acceptance with a lot of things, but with suicide loss, it is a long-term grief. because there are always the days, anniversaries. I think we talked about this in our last support group, the shoulds. So when my oldest graduates high school or they get married, there's always going to be this missing piece. And I accept that there's always going to be this missing piece.
And that's often the shape acceptance will take, for sure. Well put.
Yep. So how can people tune into you, follow you on Facebook, Instagram? I know you're all over.
Oh, I am. Yeah. On Instagram, I'm Dr. Jamie M. On Facebook, I have a professional page, Dr. Jamie Marich. Trauma Made Simple is the resource I really want to plug because that's where you can get so much of my work completely free of charge. And there's other information there on other professional trainings that I offer that you can link into and how to contact the office. My business is called the Institute for Creative Mindfulness. So if you're interested in things like EMDR training, dancing mindfulness training, yoga for clinicians training, instituteforcreativemindfulness.com is where to go.
Yeah, and the Trauma Made Simple, I feel like, is in really everyday language. It's not super clinical that anybody can pick up that book and understand what you're saying. So,
thank you. I really endeavor to write in that way. So I'm glad that that comes through.
Yeah, so I want people like, I'm not a clinician. You don't have to be a clinician. If you want to know more about trauma, or, you're kind of thinking about, do I have trauma and I just need more information? It is very easy to read, easy language to understand. So it's a really good.
And to that point, trauma competencies for all of us. If you feel I'm not a clinician, you don't have to be. I mean, educators, people who run offices can all stand to be more trauma informed. It would just help make us better people.
Better people. I think that's a good note to end on. We all need to be better people, right?
That's how we heal this thing. Yep.
Absolutely. I appreciate your time today and all of your wisdom and just always supporting Light After Loss and all the amazing work you do. So much love to you today.
Thank you, Shannon, and good for you for mastering the live stream. I look forward to watching and maybe doing some more with you down the road.
Yes. I feel like this was a success. So thank you so much for taking your time.
You're most welcome. Have a good night, Shannon.
You too. Take care. Bye. Make sure you connect with us at Light After Loss Stark on Facebook and Instagram. We obviously do have a YouTube as well. So connect with us if you are a survivor of suicide loss and you need support services. Feel free to contact us, 330-846-3630. Or you can just check us out on the web, lightafterlossstark.com. Thank you to Dr. Jamie Marich. Make sure you connect with her. On Instagram, she is at Dr. Jamie M. On Facebook, she is Dr. Jamie Marich. For all the free trauma resources, go to traumamadesimple.com. It's a great place to start to learn, watch videos, and tap into the trauma piece that we addressed here today. If you have a little light, give it. If you need a little light, take it. That way, nobody will ever walk in darkness. Be well.